Woo! Hi, I'm Edmunds, and I just found out that I'm also a training project manager. I thought I was just a senior trainer, but many of you already know I'm responsible for trainings, and this will be a small session of the same thing. So what I'm going to show you today and talk is how to deploy very simple HA solution. I call it Zabbix HA clusters 333, so 3 nodes for databases, 3 nodes for server, and 3 nodes for frontend. Why and what it is, what it consists of. We want to keep things simple, basic starting level. We saw some very complicated, very designed and thought over solutions. But my thing here is to just bare minimum of where to start with. So this is tested, common, and time-proven solution. So we have done similar setups, of course, more complicated ones, for many of our customers, and many of them use that. Open source components used, and 2 HA starts with 3. So that's why 333. This is a plan, what we want to achieve. So we have 3 DB nodes, 3 server nodes, and 3 front-end nodes. And then we have, for every cluster, we have a virtual IP, which shows which of the nodes are active at the very moment. And next thing, as I mentioned, bare minimum, we don't want to overcomplicate things. Let's make it simple. Let's understand the basics, how those things work, how they interact with each other. And nodes will switch automatically if the base resource dies, or we'll lose some connectivity. And we have a manual control to override in case of problems. And also, this is very useful when you want to update your HA. So, the idea is I can click on any node at any moment from Zabbix and switch to what node I want. So if I see that something is wrong, or I just want to bring down, let's say, one first server node, I can click on the second one and move resources to that one. And that can be done from Zabbix interface itself. And when it has happened, we will see this is actually using official out-of-the-box available template. No need to add something special or be a scripting ninja here. Just add your virtual IP server and link to the default Linux template. Of course, you must have a Zabbix agent, and you must enable remote commands on all the nodes for this to work. So, and to understand how MySQL replication will happen, we will have 3 nodes, master, slave, master, slave, master, slave setup, and in circular fashion. So if we, at some point, want to update or test something, we can bring down the middle node and interact with the first one. Our replication stops at this moment. And if we use enough, we have given enough time for our binary logs, well, let's say 3 days, we can keep it down for 3 days. Then bring it up, and replication will be pushed to all the nodes back. The same as we can bring down the node 2, update node 1, check if our DB has updated, everything works, and switch on the replication back, and that will be pushed to both, so node 2 and node 3. So how we can achieve that? First of all, we prepare our cluster. We will have 9 virtual machines. Each one of them has separate IPs. We give them nice host names, and we set that in all nodes in a host file. Don't rely on DNS or DHCP. So you have bare minimum. You are not relying on other systems. You want this to be robust. And of course, we have 3 virtual IPs with host names for each one of them to make things simpler. Then, each one of the boxes, virtual machines, we need to, of course, set time settings, localization, firewall, whether you are using or not. At first, you would maybe switch it off. Say Linux, always a troublemaker. So we just switch it off. Of course, etc host file, storage, that you decide where and how you put your data. But I would recommend keeping DB separately, logs and apps and configuration, of course, on separate block devices. And of course, we need Zabbix agent, as I mentioned, with remote commands and set up with proper IP addresses. So let's go on, and let's start with the DB cluster. So basic thing is we can use high availability. So yum group install high availability -y, we get it all. Or just group install HA -y. Then we need to create a user called HA cluster with our very secure password, of course. And when it's done, on every node, we can authenticate our nodes. Again, we're using the same password. We see that all nodes are authorized, and we are ready to proceed. And next steps are done only on a node 1 or 2 or 3. It doesn't matter. They will synchronize. And we introduce our cluster with specific nodes. When it's done, we can start creating our resources. And in this bare minimum setup, our resource is only virtual IP address. Yeah. We are starting it, again, simple. So our virtual IP for DB cluster. When it's done, we can check the status, whether it's OK. If we have some problems, usually there are. At first, we need to stop and start cluster over again. So they resynchronize, authentication tokens are updated, and so on. In case you are using firewall, you will need to add, of course, exclusion for our HA cluster. And this command will tell cluster if the resource was moved to other node, so it will remain on that node. It won't jump back. By default, if you bring up the resource, let's say, on the first node, something happens, it migrates to the second one. Whenever problem goes away, let's say network connectivity, it will jump back. But we don't want that. Let it stay on a node we moved our resource. And we disable the stoneit. If you don't do this in this setup, you won't be able to start your resources, because at first it demands that. But again, we will keep it simple. And who doesn't know, stoneit means that shoot the other node in the head. So, and in case you didn't know, I didn't know it myself for some time, there is a GUI. So who is the command line guy, usually? Most. But who likes doing things in GUIs in a visual interface? Not so much people. But the idea is, usually you do these setups once. And to remember what was done a year ago, 2 years ago, and to nicely see what's happening, GUIs are really helpful. Yeah? If you don't do this every day, they will be useful. And the same can be done from GUI. We can create our cluster just providing our node names and naming it. Of course, we have advanced options. Yeah, there will be a huge list of what you can do more. But if you have already created, you navigate to your GUI and just add one of the nodes from the cluster, and you will immediately see that cluster consists of 3 nodes, whether it's connected, corosing connected, and the uptime, and also you have control. You don't need to type anymore. But let's continue on the command line, our journey. And of course, for DBs, we need to install, in this scenario, we are installing MariaDB server. I would already have prepared my configuration file. Then we need to start, enable MariaDB, and we can secure our setup. In test environment, we won't be doing that, but this is the example of my configuration file. So I have basic settings for Zabbix DB and also binary logs. And my logs will expire in 5 days. So it means that I can bring some node down for 5 days. Of course, I need to have efficient storage for that, but that's very, very useful. And we deploy a configuration file on all our nodes, just adapting the server ID and, of course, providing a proper host name on every single node. A plan, remember it? So easier. Replication is the trickiest part. So I always keep my plan on a separate, let's say, monitor. So to properly set up this round replication. And we start with the first node. When we stop slave, we grant a replication for our user, and we provide IP address of our node 2. When it's done, OK, we show master status. And we must remember, or just save for a moment, which log bin file is used and position of that file. So then we go to the second node. Again, we stop the slave, then we change master. This command will introduce our master node on a second one, which will be the slave for the first one. And we provide master log bin log file from the previous step, and we need to specify a position. When it's done, we need to create grant access user will be used replicator for node 3, and of course identified by some secure password. At this moment, we can reset master node on the second one, start slave, and again we get the slave status. We see that, oh, if we see this line waiting for master to send event, it means setup was successful. Otherwise, you might need to do some debugging. Reasons might be different. One of the basic ones is improper IP addresses, DNS names. Let's start with that. But if we see this picture, boom, first replication is done. Then we proceed on the second node. Again, we get show master status. We get the bin log for bin file and position. Yeah? If you use reset master on the second node, the position will be the same as for the first one. And on the third node, same as we did on the second one. So we specify which node will be the master, and with bin log file settings with log position. And then we make our first node, we set up it as a slave for the third one. And then we get, again, we check the status of our slave. If we see that waiting for master to send events, we are done on this one. And we get the same show master status on the third one. We go to the first one, and circular setup is done. So now we can go to any of the 3 nodes, create the database, do whatever SQL queries we want. They will be replicated to all other nodes. This is done. And so this would be also a moment when we would introduce, from this moment, yeah, we can use only any of the nodes. All commands are done on same one. And we create our Zabbix database. So first of all, we create database. Don't forget about UTF-8 and Colocation. Create user. You might create users, separate users for your server for web interface. But in a test environment, I'll stick with the same one. And of course, we need to get the schema. Schema, basic settings, and pictures are included in this file, and that we can get from our Zabbix server nodes. That also I would prepare prior to these steps. When it's done, next step would be introduce partitioning, if you need that, but that's the different story. And to debug our DB cluster, some basic commands which are useful: show binary logs, slave status, master status, reset master, or we can even reset master to specific log position. We can purge our binary logs if we see they are grown too big. And flush will reset state and restart the numbering. So let's say you want to start from the scratch. So these will be useful. When it's done, we proceed with the server cluster. Server cluster, again, we install HA components, we create our cluster user, and we install our Zabbix server binaries, so daemon, but we don't start it. We don't enable, we don't start. We will let the HA do that. And of course, I've already prepared my Zabbix server configuration file. Basic settings, what we want is source IP address. We put to virtual IP. And our DB host, of course, we use virtual IP address from our DB cluster. So these are basic settings. And of course, our DB password, credentials, password. And this must be deployed on all server nodes. When it's done, we create, again, we authenticate the nodes, we create our server cluster, and we disable Stoneit for fencing. When it's done, restart the cluster, so reload the certificates and authentication things. And again, we switch on stickiness. So if we migrate manually, resources, so virtual IP address and Zabbix will be started, Zabbix server binaries will be started on particular node. And we are ready to introduce our resources. So resource first, of course, is virtual IP address and the control of our Zabbix server daemon. So we can't have two Zabbix daemons running simultaneously. So that's why this makes sure only on one node particular Zabbix server is online. So let's go further. Colocation of resources, we set up so both virtual IP and server daemon can run only on the same node. Then, in specific order, we must have virtual IP before our Zabbix daemon starts. Otherwise, it will crash and won't start. When it's done, we also can set our timeout settings for resources, and we can check our cluster. So PCS status will show us that Zabbix server cluster, stack corosync, and we see on which node currently that resources are running, and of course, resources themselves. Front-end cluster, similar setup. Again, HA components, we create user, and we install only Zabbix Web MySQL. Yeah, you know that from packages, it will deploy Apache with all needed dependencies. All that will be installed automatically, and we avoid starting it manually, and we don't enable. Again, we will allow PCSD to take care of that. And I have already prepared a configuration file for front-end. We use virtual IPs for our server cluster nodes and virtual IP for DB server nodes that we use in our setup of front-end. When it's done, we also create virtual host in Apache so we can monitor a status of Apache itself. And we need to configure listening port of Apache to virtual IP of front-end cluster. Or there is another option. We can leave it on default one, which is all interfaces, all IP addresses, and use master setup. So meaning all nodes will be active, but that might create some complications, some unneeded problems. So when it's done, we are ready to authenticate cluster nodes. We create our cluster, and again, restart, and we disable Stoneit. The same as on all previous clusters. So virtual IP is the first resource we create for this cluster, and next one, second resource, is a control of Apache service. So whenever we switch to the next node, Apache will be started on particular one. Additional settings we need is colocation, again, so the virtual IP and Apache, we make sure they are running on the same node. And we need to start, again, them in specific order, so virtual IP first, and then Zabbix frontend. Resource stickiness, again, if we migrate manually or by some timeouts or network issues, so they will stay on that node, and of course, start-stop timeout operations. It's done, and we are ready. Simple, right? I thought so. Not so simple. But still, this is like bare minimum. Where to get more information about this? Google, of course, our friend, or maybe Yandex in Russia. have a couple, in last years, I think I used it once, but still, it's in my mind. Of course, Red Hat documentation has a lot details and information we can get on this topic. Then you navigate to so Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, for example, and search for high availability add-on reference. Nicely explained all what you can do there. Next, of course, is Cluster Labs, has nice information, and Zabbix sales might lead you in a correct direction, for example, to our support engineers. But they will ask some money for that. So that's it. Thank you.